It's often the case in archaeological scholarship and actually good science that whenever an adventurous and unusual new thesis is published, attempts will be made to falsify it. Graham Hancock, America Before. That's what we're going to do today. I'm going to provide my humble critique on Graham Hancock's new show, Ancient Apocalypse. Is that what it's called? I wrote 59 pages of notes and didn't double check the name. Graham Hancock, in his latest Netflix show, continues to argue for the existence of a lost, advanced civilization at some point in the Ice Age. As anyone will know who watched the show, 99% of archaeologists reject these ideas. Today, I'm going to try my best to explain why. With no personal insults or attacks or anything like that. I know people aren't interested in those. We're just going to discuss the evidence. It really does speak for itself. We'll start off with some fundamental criticisms of this idea, and then we're going to break it down episode by episode, and I'll give you my thoughts. I actually think I'm well placed to offer Graham these criticisms in a way because I'm not an expert. I don't have this dogmatic view that I've kept to for my whole career. My job doesn't depend in any way on maintaining some archaeological orthodoxy. Not that anyone's job does, but mine certainly doesn't. I'm not even motivated by money at. Sponsored by Morning Brew, the #1 free newsletter on tech, finance, business, the industries that move our world. Before I start, I don't want anyone watching the show who's a fan of Graham Hancock or who stumbled upon the show and thought, well, maybe there's something on YouTube about criticizing these ideas. I don't want anybody who saw the show, who likes his books, to think that I think you're an idiot. I definitely don't. It's a shame, we don't really learn about prehistory in school. Big media companies, they so rarely make anything about prehistory, especially prehistory outside of Europe or outside of the Mediterranean area. It's just so rare. And I know for loads of people, the sites that we saw in this show, that's the first time you've ever seen them and ever heard about them. And they're spectacular. They're absolutely incredible. I don't blame you one bit for finding it exciting, enthralling, appealing, because seeing what our ancestors were up to way deep in history, it's just fascinating. Obviously, I love it. I've dedicated my education and my career to it. And I just want you to continue that passion. Continue exploring and learning about it. Don't just listen to Graham Hancock. Listen to stuff that everyone's saying. Just learn as much as you can about prehistory, because I absolutely love it. There is this annoying sort of rhetorical trick, in a way, when you're criticizing someone else's ideas, that I'm going to sound sort of negative in this video. I can't help it, because I'm saying I disagree. But I do love all of these sites. That what our ancestors were up to is incredible. They were just as smart and human and thoughtful and caring and all of these things as we are now. Maybe they were even better in some ways in a lot of aspects. Certainly in working with their hands, I'd be useless compared to them. I just wanted to get that out of the way. I don't think you're an idiot for liking the show or agreeing with Graham, because prehistory freaking rocks, and a lot of people are only introduced to it through him. So, yeah, welcome. Check out some of my other videos, and it's going to be cool. This is just going to be like a podcast, man. You guys shouldn't even bother watching what's going on screen. Just put this on and go to sleep. Listen to my dulcet tones as you drift away. Let's get into this. We got to start with, what does Graham Hancock actually believe? That's kind of tricky to pin down. I think what Graham Hancock says he believes in a fancy Netflix show is very different to what he would say he believes if he was 10 pints deep in the pub. I think if you caught him at that moment, he's going to have a very different story to tell. But basically, that sometime in the Ice Age, there was an advanced globe-spanning civilization, including Antarctica. Specifically mentions Antarctica in both his books and this show. They at least mapped Antarctica. So, quite advanced ancient civilization. Exactly how strong this civilization, exactly how much of a presence they had on each continent is always vague. I think if you ask Graham, he would say he didn't know, but that he just believes there's like enough evidence of a connection. How advanced this civilization is again very vague. Certainly from his books and the tone of the show, certainly he believes they were farmers. That's for sure. He definitely believes they were agricultural in some way. Building with megalithic stones, making large constructions, pyramid-like constructions, very strong understanding of astronomy. But I think when Graham means advanced, he means like psychologically advanced. In his books and stuff, he really believes that they had achieved a different level of advancement to us, not technological, but spiritual, traveled through parallel dimensions, see into the future, maybe move rocks with their mind, stuff like that. He's pretty deep in there. If you catch Graham 10 pints deep, he's telling you a crazy story for sure. This civilization was wiped out during the Younger Dryas, which was a sudden return to Ice Age conditions between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago. It was sort of the last hurrah of the Ice Age. Ever since that point, we've been living in a much more warm and stable climate. And before that time point, in the Pleistocene, the climate was much more variable, much colder. And the Younger Dryas was this sort of last 1,000-year stretch of Ice Age, you could say. To call a spade, he believes in Atlantis. He sincerely believes that Plato's Atlantis was not an allegory to teach the Athenians to be more humble and blah, blah, blah. He believes that there is grains of historical truth within that story that Atlantis really existed, or that some civilization like Atlantis existed. And you can see this throughout this show. His evidence for this civilization is not really archaeological. You can watch all 8 episodes and he will never show you one single artifact from this civilization, one single building, person, piece of genetic evidence. All 8 episodes, he won't show you anything, with the possible exception of the Bimini Road. I don't know who he thinks built that, but what he really believes in is myths. That myths contain historical truths in them, and that flood myths from around the world, comet myths, myths of giants, things like that, they're all referring back to this Younger Dryas period, which wiped out the civilization, and we've forgotten about it. We're a species with amnesia, is what he loves to say. Many archaeologists would agree, by the way, that myths contain historical truths. Myths are created by humans. Humans are shaped by their environment, their experiences. The lines between myth and oral history is blurry. I couldn't tell you the difference between them. I do think Graham accepts myth too uncritically, and we'll get into that later. But this is all really deeply connected to his New Age religious ideas, I think. I could be wrong. I've never spoken to the guy, but it seems pretty obvious this is all connected to his personal, spiritual, religious ideas. He hints at that throughout the show when he starts talking about how Gobekli Tepe is a time capsule and stuff like that, and you start to see the elements of his spiritual beliefs creep in, but he doesn't really bring it up in the show. As I said, in his book, America Before, that I quoted from at the start, he does wonder if this civilization had psychic powers. That's his definition of advanced. He, I think, believes that sort of the pinnacle of man's achievements is not the technology that we have today, but a more spiritual development, and that this society, prepared itself for life in the afterlife. That was their number one goal. I only bring this up. This actually doesn't matter, and I don't mind what Graham Hancock believes. I actually share a lot of his opinions about psychedelic drugs. I do think our society has criminalized them too much, and that, we could have a much healthier relationship to them, to these things that could really truly be medicine for people with things like PTSD and stuff like that. I agree with him. I bet if we sat down at the pub, we would agree about a lot. But I mention it because in the show, he really sort of paints this picture of a man who is just following the clues wherever they lead. And I don't think that's true. I think, in a way, he reminds me of biblical archaeologists in that his starting point is a sincere belief in this text, in Plato's Atlantis and these other myths. And he's going around the world to find pieces that fit that puzzle in the same way a biblical archaeologist is, in a way, trying to find, sites that relate to the Bible. They're not so interested in other stuff. Any sites that really contradict Graham's ideas, he doesn't really bother with them, I feel like. And obviously, I've got lots of examples today. But yeah, we're not going to dig into his New Age religious beliefs because so many of his fans don't share them. If you go on the Hancock subreddit, Graham Hancock subreddit, a lot of people who like what he's got to say don't believe in any of that. They just want to know if there was an advanced civilization. And so that's all we're going to focus on. But as I say, I just mention it because I do feel like he's got a big bias when he's looking at these things, a really big bias. We're going to just take the strongest possible interpretation of his ideas. We're not going to make any straw men, which is what he does throughout the show. The straw men are so ridiculous, they're not even straw men, it's just loose hay. We're going to take the strongest possible interpretation of his ideas, that there was just any form of globe-spanning, like transcontinental, urban, agricultural society in the Ice Age. That's all we're talking about. Was there anything like that which existed? And what would archaeologists consider evidence of that? In the modern world, with all the technology we have, the best source of evidence for connection between different peoples now and in prehistory is going to be DNA. That's what archaeologists, that's what geneticists would really expect to see if there was this globe-spanning civilization somewhere in prehistory. I think we would see a lot of genetic evidence for that, not just in ancient human remains, but still within us today. If you think about how advanced ancient genetics has gotten, we're looking for really tiny percentages of archaic admixture from archaic humans tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. We've gotten so good at that. If we were sort of interconnected on like an urban scale, I think we would see a lot of evidence within that in our DNA. It's like if you're ever scrolling on TikTok or something and you see someone from like Honduras do an ancestry DNA test, and they're related to absolutely everyone in the world. It's like 8% Cameroon, 3% Morocco, 4% Russia, blah, 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 blah. They're just related to absolutely everyone. Because, the history of all the people traveling to the Americas, I think if we were connected on a large scale in prehistory, that's the kind of thing we would expect to see. Now, people did move a lot in prehistory. We have a lot of evidence for that archaeologically, genetically. Sometimes they moved really far distances, thousands of miles. And I don't want to say that we know everything about genetics, especially ancient genetics. We for sure do not know everything. There's still so much we can learn from that. But if we're talking about a civilization, as I say, on a global scale, I think we'd see genetic evidence of it. The fact that we don't have that, it has to keep Graham Hancock and people that really support his ideas up at night. That has to really bother them. I can't believe that it doesn't. That is the strongest piece of evidence we would need to prove the connection between groups of people, and it's basically missing. If you think about all the shows that all the places he talks about in the show, Malta, North America, South America, Antarctica, Indonesia, Turkey, Malta, really places that are really far away from each other, I think we'd find a genetic signal of that. I really think so. It's got to keep him up at night. It's got to absolutely keep him up at night. That is, in my opinion, just a baseline fundamental objection to this idea. The other biggest fundamental objection I have is food. Especially as Hancock believes that this civilization of his was agricultural and taught everyone how to farm and do all of these things. We all know before the 15th century, before Christopher Columbus and the Spanish and Portuguese made their voyages around the world, that the major crops that people ate were largely geographically distinct, especially when it came to, the old world versus the new world. In the Americas, you had corn, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, stuff like that. Turkeys, chocolate. And Europe and Eurasia and Africa, things like wheat, rice, cows, pigs, chickens, horses. If a civilization traveled around the world teaching everyone to farm, why would they be separate? You're not going to turn up to teach someone to farm and not bring any crops or animals with you, because what are you going to say to them? You're going to say, hey, you see that wild grass? Keep harvesting it, because in 2,000-3,000 years, your ancestors are really going to appreciate it. It's going to have loads more seeds. It's going to be delicious. If you were going to teach someone to farm, you would have to bring these sorts of things with them. And yet, all these foods, they were geographically separate. They were disconnected. The obvious conclusion for why everything was so separate is that these people had domesticated the native plants and animals in their environment. Not that they were taught how to farm by a civilization. Why agriculture really took off after the Younger Dryas is probably just down to a warmer and more stable climate. There's no real need for this lost civilization. It's just a warm, stable climate is great for farming. Hancock, throughout this whole show, he never even mentions or speculates about what the people of this lost civilization would have eaten. He doesn't mention it at all, because he can't. All the plants and animals that we know about, with the exception of the dog, were domesticated after the Younger Dryas. So any civilization that existed before then, what were they eating? We don't know. He always focuses on the connections between spiritual ideas, which is all well and good, for sure. It's all very well and good. But you got to eat. You've got to eat every day. And we can't understand this lost civilization if we don't make any attempt to try and work out their economy. However much they were focused on spiritual stuff, they still had to eat every day. And the fact that Graham Hancock never really investigates what they eat, doesn't really discuss the science behind the domestication of plants and animals, is again really damning. It's really damning for this whole idea that there was an urban agricultural civilization existing before the Younger Dryas. As I said, the only exception is the dog. The dog was definitely domesticated in the Ice Age, so they could have eaten dogs all the time. Maybe, I don't know. Those are my two biggest, most fundamental objections. And you might think, well, only two, that's not so bad, but making babies, making food, those are things that's going to happen on a daily basis if you're lucky. The fact that we don't have any evidence of either of those things is a big problem for Graham, especially because we have a real-life case study of a civilization, trans-oceanic civilization, in prehistory. The Polynesian people. For a long time, it was debated whether the Polynesians ever reached it to the Americas, and one of the principal pieces of evidence in favor of that idea was that sweet potatoes, which are of course native to the Americas, were widely eaten across Polynesia when the first Europeans turned up. So that's a pretty big sign that someone had made it there. It's still possible that seeds and stuff get carried across the ocean, but it's a pretty good sign that someone was there. Now, modern genetics have also revealed that Polynesian people have a Columbian genetic link to Native Americans as well, particularly people from like the northwest coast of South America. So, in a real-life case study of a seafaring, of a pre-industrial, transoceanic people, culture, the food has, been traded, swapped, and genes have been traded and swapped. That's just what we would expect to see. The fact that we see it in the Polynesians and we don't see it in prehistory, I don't know. I don't know how Graham feels about this. This is what archaeologists would want to see as evidence of this civilization. What's the problem with the evidence that Graham presents archaeologically? The love of pyramids, veneration of water, a good understanding of astronomy and changing of the seasons and all of these things. I would say the problem with these is that they are universal to all humans. A pyramid truly, I know people disagree with this line of reasoning, but a pyramid truly is the best way to build a tall building with the technology that prehistoric people had available to them. Water is essential for all human life. So it's no surprise that people in prehistory venerated springs. They had no taps back then. They had nothing like that. A spring coming from the ground, fresh water coming from the ground, that's literally life pouring out of the earth. And they would be well aware of that. They would be so much more aware of it than we are today. It's no surprise that they would consider that a special spot. The night sky, again, they're living in a time of absolutely no light pollution. They're going to be very familiar with the night sky. We don't need an advanced civilization to explain these things. Could it be possible? Sure. Anything's possible. Absolutely anything's possible. But do we need it to explain what we see in the archaeological record? Absolutely not. We just don't. Graham often asks if these things are a coincidence. And the answer is no, because all of these things are made by the same species. We don't sit there and wonder if ant nests have similarities across the world because they were shown how to build ant nests by an advanced civilization of ants. We accept that they have similarities because they're produced by the same animal, different species, but the same animal. And even though humans are way more complicated than that, it is basically the same. There are going to be fundamental similarities across all human societies because all human societies are made by humans. So if Graham wants to prove the existence of his civilization, we just have to come up with more evidence than pyramids and water and astronomy and stuff like that. Any human can work out how to do these things. The other problem with this hypothesis that the idea behind these things, not necessarily the actual monuments we have surviving today, but just the idea for agriculture, the idea for astronomy, the idea that water is important, I don't know, that these ideas came from an older civilization, is that it's not falsifiable. We can never prove it right or wrong. We can't radiocarbon date an idea. We can't travel back in time and ask someone in 11th century Mexico who was the real Quetzalcoatl. We can never ask them that. It's just not falsifiable. It's not the kind of question archaeology can answer. Like, let's say we do find a site that's like a megalithic site with all these things that's 50,000 years old. And he says, aha, this is Atlantis or whatever. I could just say, yeah, but did the idea for these things come from an older civilization? You could keep doing that for forever. And it's just not falsifiable in any way. Archaeology can never tell you where an idea came from. We just can't ask them. So that's just another fundamental problem with his idea. I don't know. How could we ever prove Graham correct? I don't know. I just don't know. As for the similarities between myths all around the world, at first glance it does seem very compelling, and the show it goes through all the similarities between these different myths from all around the world. This really isn't my strength. I don't know much about mythology, so I can't really offer much in that regard, but I would say that we can't accept them uncritically, just because different societies all around the world have flood myths. It doesn't mean that they're all referring to the same flood. First of all, again, it's not falsifiable. We can never go back in time and ask them which flood they're talking about. So, again, how would we ever prove Graham correct? I don't know. I will say one thing about flood myths, though. There was probably like a flood myth in the region of Western Asia, in the Middle East, that spawned like the flood myth in Gilgamesh and Noah's Ark and all of these things. Probably any flood myths in India too. Those two regions traded and were in contact in prehistory, definitely. You could say that maybe those flood myths all have, their origins in an older story. I'm perfectly willing to accept that and believe that. I think we would underestimate the reach of that original story for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we know that that's the region where agriculture, the Fertile Crescent, first developed. It developed in lots of different regions independently, all around the world, but the Fertile Crescent is certainly one home region of agriculture. The people that lived in that region spread across Europe, probably to North Africa too, probably to other places as well, and brought agriculture with them over thousands of years. They just spread out and spread out and spread out as far as the north of Scotland, Orkney in the north of Scotland. Farmers, the Neolithic farmers that lived there, were related distantly to the Neolithic farmers that first originated in Turkey and the Aegean region. So you could literally have a flood myth from the far north of Scotland that has a lot of similarities to the flood myth of Noah and Gilgamesh and all of these things. A lot of similarities, and that's not because they're referencing the same global flood, but because the people have like an ancestral relationship to that region. You know, with the spread of farming that we now know was carried largely by migration out of these sort of centers of domestication, I think we can underestimate the initial spread of these myths. Like literally all of these myths could have come from one flood in Turkey. As for when it gets to the New World, it's complicated. This isn't my area of expertise. World of Antiquity has done great videos on this, Dr. David Miano. I'm sure if you know my channel, you know him, you love him, he's a legend. He's made much better videos about this, but a lot of these myths come to us from Spanish accounts. You know, we can't go back in time to 15th century Mexico and get an idea of these beliefs that wasn't filtered through a Spanish monk who sincerely believed in Noah's flood, and maybe he's like trying to tie two and two together with flood myths that he's learning about. You know, we just can't accept them uncritically. We can't accept them uncritically. We can't assume that all these, phenomenon like floods and stuff are referring to one specific flood. We have no evidence for that, and it's just not falsifiable. So how will we ever prove Graham right? I don't know. And then, of course, what about myths and origin stories that don't mention floods or knowledge bringers or anything like that? How do they fit into this picture? I don't know. I just think we can't accept them uncritically. I do believe that there are grains of historical truth in myths, and those grains of historical truth could go back 10,000 years. I don't know. But we can't accept them uncritically. For me personally, if there's a contradiction between like a myth and archaeology, I would go with the archaeology because it's just not falsifiable. I'm probably going to say that so many times in this whole episode. I can't believe I'm 40 minutes in and I haven't even talked about a single episode yet. This is crazy. How am I doing here battery-wise? All right, episode 1. Once there was a flood. I think one of the biggest differences between Graham Hancock and archaeologists is that I think Graham Hancock is sort of forced into this position where he has to believe hunter-gatherers are simple. You see it straight away in the first episode where he says the The so-called experts say that only people who lived in the Ice Age were simple hunter-gatherers. No archaeologist who studies that period would describe hunter-gatherers as simple. They were incredible artists. They created really large monuments out of things like mammoths, like at Kostenki in Russia. Even Neanderthals would explore deep into caves and seemingly create like circles out of stalagmites or stalactites. I don't know which way round it is. In East Asia, hunter-gatherers were making pottery. In Europe, they were making like ceramic art, the Venus figurines, female figurines. In the region of the Fertile Crescent, people in the Natufian culture were already starting to build in stone before the Younger Dryas. They're building, houses with stone floors, stone foundations, things like that. They created all sorts of things out of wood, which have been absolutely lost to history. You have to bear that in mind. How much stuff have we lost simply because wood isn't preserved? We see little glimpses of it with the Shugir idol, which has just been preserved by fluke because of the conditions in that specific area. But how many huge statues and totems and things like this were made out of wood, which have been lost to history? So many, undoubtedly. Just because a society isn't farming, it doesn't mean that they are simple people. That's just not the opinion of archaeologists. Graham Hancock has to kind of take this position a little bit, though, because he needs a really as big a gap as possible between the developments in the Neolithic period, like farming, like towns and villages and monumental architecture, things like that. He needs there to be as big a gap as possible between that and lives in the Paleolithic, because he needs this civilization to have taught people how to do it. They have to appear out of nowhere as if they were just shown how one day. So any discussion of how sophisticated life was in the Paleolithic, he sort of has to relegate it a little bit. He can't really talk about it or discuss it, because then you might start thinking, why do we need Atlantis to explain the existence of Gobekli Tepe? They were already building with stone like 2,000-3,000 years before then. So we'll see it time and time throughout this series. If you watch it, Graham Hancock will always refer to hunter-gatherers as sort of simple and blah, blah, blah. And that's just not how any archaeologist would view them at all. I say no archaeologist, I don't know. There's probably a few snooty people that do the Roman Empire who think the Paleolithic is absolute garbage, but anyone who studies that time period would never describe them as simple. Anyway, focus of the episode 1 is Gunung Padang. Truly incredible megalithic site in Indonesia. Hancock kind of sets up a little bit of a straw man straight from the get-go, I would say, by saying, for a long while, archaeologists thought it was just another hill in the jungle. I don't know what he means by this. I'm not an expert on the site. It was first visited by Europeans in 1890, and they immediately recognized it for what it was. This is coming from 1890. On the mountaintop Gunung Padang near Gunung Melati, a succession of 4 terraces connected by steps of rough stone, paved with rough flat stones, and decorated with numerous sharp and columnar upright andesite stones. On each terrace, a small mound, probably a grave, covered with stones and topped with 2 pointed stones. So immediately, as far long back as 1890, archaeologists didn't think it was just a hill. So I don't know what Graham Hancock means when he says that about archaeologists. Yeah, I already feel like 6 minutes into the first episode, we've been misled on 2 occasions as to what archaeologists would actually say or believe. Doesn't bode well, I would say, for the series. Anyway, we meet Ali Akbar, an archaeologist who worked at Gunung Padang in 2012, and Graham's argument of dogmatic archaeologists who won't change their mind because this existence of this civilization threatens everything they've taught us for the past 100 years, goes away, so we have to stick to the dogma. Literally, the first appearance of an archaeologist on screen, he freely admits that they don't know the absolute dating of the site. He doesn't stick to it dogmatically at all. This archaeologist also I think was behind the discovery that the blocks had been carried up the hill from another location, maybe 50,000 blocks. So certainly a huge, expensive time and effort. Again, perfectly happy to believe that people did that. Can you guys hear my baby crying? I might have to pause this a second. I'll just finish this point. And they realized that there was 2 episodes of activity at the site, one from 500 BC, the other from 5200 BC. So again, they're willing to project the life of this site back in time 5,000 years. It doesn't seem very dogmatic of the archaeology profession to discover all these things. And then again, he seems to dunk on simple hunter-gatherers, saying the people of the region weren't builders on an epic scale 5,000 years ago, despite standing in a building from that region, potentially from that time. Sometimes with Graham dunking on hunter-gatherers like that, it feels a little bit like I'm watching a show from the 1920s, not the 2020s. That's just not the modern opinion of archaeologists. Let me check on my baby. 1 second. All right, I'm back. Sorry, had to help put my kids to sleep. If you hear a noise, it's because they're not sleeping yet. All right, so we're at Gunung Padang. We meet Ali Akbar, and then we meet Dr. Danny Hillman Natwajaja. Dr. Danny Hillman Natwajaja. Please forgive me for saying that incorrectly. He's a geologist and author of Plato Never Lied, Atlantis is in Indonesia. Hancock says that Dr. Danny discovered the fact that the basalt wraps around the slopes. I don't think that's true. I don't know, but I doubt that's true. In photo from Ali Akbar's excavations earlier, rocks on the terraces are clearly visible. Early reconstructions before Dr. Danny's work show the site as terraced. The first description in 1890 said the site was terraces. So I don't know where this claim comes from. To be fair to Dr. Danny, he doesn't make this claim. Only Graham says that. So I don't know if he would say that. But I don't think it's true. I doubt that that's true. Dr. Danny, the geologist, was given a sort of big grant by the Indonesian government at the time to explore this. And one of the ways that they researched Gunung Padang is through like ground penetrating radar, where Dr. Danny believes it shows that there are 3 interior chambers under the hill, which is possible. It's entirely possible that those exist. Are they man-made, though? I don't know. In this whole episode, they keep calling Gunung Padang a hill. They never mention, as far as I'm aware, that it was an extinct volcano. I think I'm right in saying that. Volcanoes, of course, famous for their inner chambers. I think that if I'm right in thinking that this was a volcano, I think they deliberately omit that to make the case for inner chambers sound a little bit more convincing. But anyway, no archaeologist would mind if there were chambers in there. Pyramids in Egypt, Mexico, lots of places have chambers inside them. So there's no archaeological objection really to the fact that there are chambers there. How do you know those chambers are man-made would be the question. And then Graham is annoyingly like, oh, if only the archaeologists would excavate. I got so much to say about that. Archaeology departments, universities worldwide, really underfunded. Okay, it's not up to archaeologists whether they get to excavate these sites or not. That's really not a fair criticism. And the other issue is now archaeologists are really interested in site preservation. The days of just dynamiting your way into a pyramid are fortunately long gone. We have to think about preserving these sites. It's all excavations ultimately destroy the site, sometimes in a big way, sometimes in a small way. And we have to think carefully about when to do that. Do we have the right to so badly damage Gunung Padang to satisfy our curiosity? These are not easy questions to answer, but it's certainly, if you think there's just archaeologists being offered the time and money to excavate these sites and they're refusing to do it, I promise you that is not the case. Anyway, the other thing that Dr. Danny did was core drilling. to try and get to the age of the site. And he claims there are layers in the site that could date back to 11,600 years ago, to the Younger Dryas. All roads lead to the Younger Dryas in the show. But maybe it's even older, maybe 20,000 years ago. I would say I don't believe he's submitted that report for peer review, which is very important because no one doubts that Gunung Padang was it's been a natural hill or volcano that's been terraced. If you're digging down with a core, you can keep drilling for forever, really. And the dates are just going to keep getting older and older and older. I think the dates where it's like 20,000 years old are between like 15 and 30 meters. Very, very deep. And how do you know that the soil that you're dating, that there is any human activity at that time? You can date the soil and get the date of 20,000 years. The point is, were humans there then building Gunung Padang? You can hear the difference when Ali Akbar's talking about the site and Graham and Dr. Danny are talking about the site. Ali Akbar dated the site on the oldest cultural layer, the oldest layer they found that still had human remains. But as for what Dr. Danny dated at that 20,000-year-old layer, we don't know. We don't know. If he's correct, though, archaeologists don't have a problem with that. It's younger than that big mammoth enclosure in Kostenki, Russia that I mentioned earlier. And archaeologists don't have a problem with hunter-gatherers organizing each other and creating complex megalithic structures, big buildings like that. There's no archaeological objection, really. The point is just, do you know that? Do you know that what you've dated is truly 20,000 years ago? And on top of that, just because maybe people were living there 20,000 years ago, does that mean the whole site dates that time period? You have to prove those things. We can speculate all day, but you have to prove those things. Even all of that is proven, is it evidence of a lost civilization? I would say no. It's just evidence of people in that location doing crazy stuff. So even if everything Dr. Danny said was correct, it's still not proof of this globe-spanning civilization, in my opinion. I don't know. I do wonder, though. You can judge for yourselves. Is the man who published Plato was right, Atlantis was Indonesia? He published that at least a couple of years before he started working on this site. You can't help but wonder if he had a target in mind when he's trying to get these dates. I don't know. Was he biased? I don't know. It's definitely a possibility, though. Okay, final point of the episode. All right, episode 2. What's the name of this one? Episode 2, Survivor in a Time of Chaos. We're over in Mesoamerica now, off to Cholula. Truly incredible site in Mexico. I'm the least familiar with everything they talked about on the show. I'm the least familiar with Mesoamerica, so I was so keen to watch this one, honestly. Like I told you at the start, I just want to see these things, these sites being given the attention they deserve. And I just wish someone made an 8-part series on the civilization that built Cholula. 8-part series on the Aztec Empire. I just wish Netflix had done that. And it would be incredible. But anyway, that's where we are. Mexico. Cholula. Again, as I said at the start, this is the idea that pyramids and the veneration of water are a legacy of Atlantis, a legacy of this lost civilization. And I just disagree, I just disagree. It's not falsifiable. What's the evidence for that? Mexicans drink water. I've seen it firsthand. It's just, why is that evidence for Atlantis? The chambers inside the pyramids, again, why is that the exclusive domain of this lost civilization? The fact that the building is aligned with the solstice, again, they're perfectly capable of working these things out, the people that built Cholula. There's literally like sun and water, two things we can't live without. The idea that any human anywhere in the world needs the inspiration to consider these things important is, to me, silly. It's silly. We need to come up with better evidence for Atlantis than this. I think with the pyramids, this is a bit of Graham Hancock's New Age religion coming in again when he says, all pyramids are associated with what happens after you die. And he's showing like a Hindu temple built around the year 1000, Mexican pyramids, Egyptian pyramids. There's loads of subtle differences between them. Egyptian pyramids were tombs. I know lots of Graham Hancock fans will disagree with me on that, but Egyptian pyramids were definitely tombs. Mexican pyramids, some were tombs, some Mayan pyramids were tombs, but they also had temples on the top of them. And we can't ignore that sort of ritual aspect. And as for the Hindu temple, I'm not super familiar with Hinduism and these temples, but I imagine there's a lot of differences between their religion, why they built that building, compared to why an Egyptian built a building like that, or why someone in Cholula built a building like that. We can't really ignore all the nuance behind these beliefs. How can we ignore those things? Yeah, but I think this is Graham Hancock having sort of a religious, semi-spiritual belief in the power of pyramids. I think so. I think that's creeping in. And again, we meet an archaeologist. What's his name? Let me pull that up. Should have written it down. Sorry. Jeff McCafferty. Yeah, so we're joined by archaeologist Jeff McCafferty, who Graham asks if we have enough information to be confident about Mexican prehistory. He freely admits no, just like Ali Akbar, just like every archaeologist you're going to see in this whole show. There's such a contrast between how Graham talks about archaeologists as this dogmatic, closed-minded profession, and then every archaeologist he meets will freely admit that we don't know everything. We need to do more work. There's loads more questions we need to answer. It's such a contrast. And that's really all there is to say about Cholula in this episode. It is an incredible site. I should make a video on it, honestly. But Graham doesn't really dispute any of the archaeology behind the site. It's just that he feels that, as I said, sun, water, pyramids, these are a legacy of Atlantis, and I just disagree. Next part of the episode, we're off to Texcoco. I had never heard of this place, so this was really interesting. Again, he's really stretching the definition of pyramid here. He mentions this in the first episode, and he's like, sort of tentatively admits we're dealing with the question of definitions here when he describes Gunung Padang, a terraced hill, as a pyramid. Cholula is a true pyramid. And then Texcoco, again, he describes as a pyramid, but this really just seems like they've sort of flattened some areas of a hill. It doesn't look like a pyramid to me, but I'm not super familiar with it. But the interesting thing about this site is that this is really modern, from the 15th century. It's not really from the ancient times. It's built a lot more recently than many of the medieval buildings across Europe, across England. It's really from the historical time period. And Graham always goes with the what if it's older, what if. Yeah, if your auntie had wheels, she'd be a bicycle, but she doesn't. We could ask what if for forever. Point is, what does the evidence say? Graham calls upon author Marco Vigato, author of Empire of Atlantis, to provide us with evidence of this ancient site. They didn't really come up with any evidence. What is it they said? Just that they point to an old, a rock that's clearly on top of, the 15th century architecture, it seems, just a cursory glance. They say this rock shows that it's older. Then they're talking about the Aztecs talking about how there's been a section carved into bedrock, as if the Aztecs couldn't do that. They don't really provide any evidence that this site is older than the 15th century. Graham's decision to put this Marco Vigato character in the show is really questionable. This guy's a real crackpot. I actually bought Empires of Atlantis and read the first, I would say, 3 chapters of it, the first, third of it. This guy is a real crackpot, okay? He speculates that, Cro-Magnons, which there's always a red flag when someone talks about Cro-Magnon, because It's just a very old term. Archaeologists don't really use the term Cro-Magnon anymore. It's just the fact that the oldest Homo sapiens in Europe, when they were first discovered, we've since found older ones, but when they were first discovered in Europe, were found in the Cro-Magnon cave, I believe. And it's kind of a red flag. There are people out there who believe that Cro-Magnon is not Homo sapiens, or that they're the original Homo sapiens and that Africans are not really Homo sapiens. Bit of a red flag. But yeah, in this book, he's talking about how early humans were genetically engineered to be Atlanteans, to be slave laborers. Humans didn't evolve as such with a bodily incarnation on the physical plane of higher spiritual entities. And then again, he starts talking about anatomically modern people emerged from the North Pole 2 million years ago, or maybe Homo erectus evolved on Atlantis into humans under the guidance of highly spiritual early hominins, still more ape than human. That's a quote, by the way, and these people created the races of man. It's real psychobabble. It's really taking people's like visions and hallucinations and just creating this fantasy of human prehistory around it. He also worryingly talks of modern humans belonging to the Aryan root race, talks about ancient Aryan empires. It's so weird, like to the point where if you showed me this book, he said some weird guy from 1939 Berlin had written it, I would probably believe you. It's really crazy nonsense as far as I'm concerned. Totally unscientific. Don't even look for any evidence to anything this guy talks about in there. Yeah, it's really odd that Graham in this Netflix show, big Netflix show, 8-part series on Netflix, would choose to highlight the works of this man and this man's interpretation of Mesoamerican art. How can you trust, like someone who has such a loose grasp on prehistory, how can I trust his interpretation of anything Mesoamerican? It's really bizarre that Graham would choose to highlight this man's work. I don't personally think Graham Hancock is a racist, just to put that out there. Yeah, his wife's African, mixed race son, who happens to be an executive at Netflix. Small coincidence there, I'm sure. Sean Hancock. But, you know, this Sean Hancock chap, he wrote a book about the struggles of growing up in rural England as a mixed race child. Graham's, of course, familiar with this. I obviously know absolutely nothing of their family dynamic, but I don't believe Graham Hancock is a racist man, but I think he's just got blinders on for anything that'll slightly support his opinion. He's gonna look into it. He's gonna investigate it, even if it means working with some really odd characters. Yeah, and then back to the myth of Quetzalcoatl, which, you know, Graham Hancock describes him as a foreigner, bearded. That's just his bias. There's no reason to believe that because he had a beard, he wasn't a Mexican, a Native American. They can grow beards. He doesn't mention it in the show, but Quetzalcoatl is described as white. I don't know if he's described like that in every myth, but he certainly does get described like that sometimes. I'm starting to get out of my depth again here. World of Antiquity, Dr. David Miano, he did a much better video than I could ever do on this subject. I'll link it in the description, but let's just think critically for a moment about the myth of Quetzalcoatl. And this I ripped like verbatim from David Miano's video, so go check that out. But it's a very good point that he made. Let's say the idea of a white Quetzalcoatl is not the invention of Spanish conquistadors, but truly came from the original religion of the Mexica, of the Aztecs, of the Nahuatl people, or of all Mesoamerican people. It's probably a very widespread belief. Let's say that the Spanish didn't invent that. They still chose to preserve that myth. They still wanted to promote the idea of Quetzalcoatl as white and foreign. They were burning codices, Aztec and Mayan codices, all the time, destroying them. No hesitation to destroy them. Why preserve this one? Is it because they recognize the sort of political value of this legend for them? And we're still falling for the same trick now, 500 years later. It's certainly possible. Certainly possible. Again, we can't just accept these myths at face value. We have to remember who is passing them on. And why, and what are their motivations for doing so. It's a key piece of evidence. And again, they don't, when they're with the Aztec site, they speculate that it's older, don't really provide any evidence. With the Mayan sites and the myth of Quetzalcoatl, they're just resorting to myth. Again, in this episode, I feel like we've been presented with no evidence of a lost civilization, no actual evidence. It's only evidence if you believe that the idea for these things, pyramids, water, the veneration of water, the veneration of light, things like that, it's only evidence if you believe those ideas could have only come from Atlantis, and that ancient Mexican people couldn't have worked these things out on their own. So 2 episodes deep, we've not had a single artifact, human remain, or anything of this lost civilization. As a small aside, with the fact that Texcoatzingo is so recent, like 15th century construction, I would love it if there was a Mexican Graham Hancock character who came around Britain and was like, sure, the English say they built Westminster Abbey, sure, they say they built the Tower of London, or Windsor Castle, or St. Paul's Cathedral, but could they have done it without the help of Atlantis? Are the seeds of these buildings really hidden in some lost information? And they're just going around buildings that, are relatively modern and, we know about in the historical records. It would be so funny. Maybe I'll have to get a Mexican guy to work on a parody of this idea with me. You can't help but wonder, do they pick on these sites because people are so unfamiliar with Mesoamerican history? Why doesn't Marco Vergato walk around the Vatican and talk about a legacy of Atlantis? I don't know. Episode 3, Sirius Rising, over in Malta. This episode starts with Graham Hancock rejecting the notion that our current time is the pinnacle of human achievement, that we view our ancestors as simpler. Again, as I said, Graham's definition of advanced, I think, is spiritually advanced, but still he believes in this globe-spanning civilization. Yeah, I think we can sort of negatively view our ancestors. I do kind of agree with this point. Our ancestors were not simpler than us or dumber than us in any way. They achieved so much with way less than what we have. We're really standing on the shoulders of giants, to use that expression. All of our achievements are based on hundreds of years of scientific development, thousands of years of scientific development. The fact that our ancestors could build pyramids, could do all these crazy things without inheriting all that knowledge, just by working it out themselves, is a testament to how smart they are. We do definitely live in the most technologically advanced time, though, for sure. No doubt about that. Anyway, we're over in Malta, to the Neolithic temples there. I was actually really surprised to see this as a topic for his series, because I've seen other interviews with Graham, like this one on London Real. But in this interview on London Real, Graham doesn't doubt for 1 second that Stonehenge was built by Neolithic farmers. And, he goes into how in Neolithic societies, they're producing a surplus of food, blah, blah, blah. They're able to, with that surplus of food, devote part of their time in the year to building these monuments. Stonehenge is, of course, a megalithic structure, very orientated to the solstice and to the alignments of the sun and the stars. And so I just feel like, why is Malta different to that? These Maltese temples were built by a Neolithic society too, producing a food surplus, they're spending some of their year producing these monuments. What's the difference between a Maltese temple and Stonehenge, really? Why is Stonehenge so accepted and these Maltese temples are not, when there's very little fundamental difference between them and there's very little difference in the societies that produced them? I would love to know how Graham, accepts an archaeological conclusion or rejects it, because Now Graham is very anti-ancient aliens, but he didn't used to be ancient aliens. He wrote a book, The Mars Mystery. I actually got it over there. Shall I be bothered to get it off the table? Fine. Where Oh, it's right here next to me. Yeah, he wrote a book, The Mars Mystery. Basically, the civilization on Mars in this book is the role of Atlantis, spreading knowledge with Earth. And this time it's NASA, who are sort of closed-minded and secretive and not archaeologists. And now he's very against ancient aliens. So I would just love to know how he rejects an idea. What's his criteria for rejecting an idea? Why did he reject ancient aliens? Why does he accept that Stonehenge is a Neolithic construction when the megaliths at Stonehenge are huge? They're massive. And they were carved with joints and everything to keep the beams on top in position. And it's the only Neolithic stone circle where there's a crossbeam across the top of two stones. It's a truly unique Neolithic monument made out of massive stones. And yet he accepts that and rejects Maltese temples. I don't know. I would love to know how he decides these things. Whatever the reason, Malta is in his sights. His central premise here is that the temples are only dated to sort of 5600 BC. He picks on a temple Gigantea because of artifacts found there, much artifacts from other simpler sites. There's no radiocarbon dating or anything like that. And that's not true. We're going to go into that. But he says, think about, could those farmers who archaeologists tell us never built anything bigger than a shack really have achieved all this? It's such an odd turn of phrase because archaeologists don't tell you these farmers only built a shack. They tell you they built these temples. And anyway, the lifestyle of these farmers is no different to the lifestyle of farmers in Britain at the same time. And you're perfectly happy for them to have built Stonehenge. I don't know how that works. I don't know how that works in Graham's mind. Archaeologists did not tell you these people only lived in shacks. Archaeologists literally tell you that they built these temples. You're the one saying that they only live in shacks and couldn't have done these things. But his idea is that people can't move 20 to 30 ton megaliths without practicing first. Prehistoric people couldn't have worked this out. You have to start with moving a 1 ton block and then you build up through time as your skills develop into moving 30 ton blocks. I just don't think that's true. If a whole town of people wanted to do something, a whole village of people wanted to move a block like that, they could work it out. There's no reason to think that they couldn't. I think modern people would be capable of working it out. If you got 100 modern people together and they were really determined to do it, they could carve and move a block like that. And prehistoric people were exactly the same. They were just as smart as us. And then he says Malta has too many temples for them to have been built on such a small island that it would have required too much manpower. But these temples are not built at the same time. The Maltese temple period lasted 1,400 years, archaeologists believe. So again, he's just creating these sort of straw man arguments that prehistoric people couldn't have moved large blocks. Yes, they could have. Archaeologists said they only lived in shacks. No, they don't. We think we built the temples. There's not enough manpower to build all these temples on a small island. Well, they were built over a period of over 1,000 years. I don't know. Just straw man arguments, I feel like. He doesn't actually present to you what archaeologists think about these things. Anyway, his idea that these sites are not radiocarbon dated is wrong. Archaeological study between 2013 and 2018 specifically aimed at examining the culture behind Maltese temples. 155 useful radiocarbon dates from across temple sites across Malta were obtained. We're going to stick to Gigantea, just because I don't have time to talk about all of them. But there's 2 trenches open just outside the main temple of Gigantea to see what was going on there. They dated the soil underneath a megalith to 8,770 BC, plus or minus 600 years. Way older than the Neolithic period. Older than the Neolithic period by few thousand years. But crucially, thousands of years after the Younger Dryas as well, several thousand years after the Younger Dryas. And this doesn't indicate when the temple was built as such, but it indicates the oldest possible date that megalith could have been put there. The soil, you can't date rock left there. Dating rock isn't actually that useful. You need to be able to date when the rock was put where it is. And it can't have been put there before 8,000 BC. I still think it was put there in the Neolithic period. There's no reason to doubt that, because in the other trench, they had radiocarbon dates that are dated to the Neolithic period, 2300 BC, again, just outside Gigantia. They excavated like a causeway with these megaliths up to the site. Right at the sort of end of this Neolithic period, they're still working on the site there. And again, there's like Neolithic pottery underneath these megalithic stones that they excavated. So, let's say Graham Hancock's right that this site is only dated on artifacts. Well, where are those artifacts? If those artifacts are under the megalithic rocks, then those rocks were put there, like, after those artifacts were made. Point is, his fundamental point that the dating of these sites is very questionable is not on solid ground. There are a lot of dates, 155 dates. There's artifacts, Neolithic artifacts from under megalithic stones. The dating of these sites is on way more solid ground than he would suggest. He chats to a chap called Dr. Mifsud to sort of set the scene of how archaeologists ignore Malta. Dr. Mifsud has been investigating these teeth that were found in 1917 and discussed in this paper from 1924. Seems like these are Neanderthal teeth. And I think Graham and Dr. Mifsud are right that this discovery was largely ignored. I think they're correct about that. At this point in time when Neanderthals were living, like, this is way deeper in the Ice Age, Malta was still attached to Sicily. No archaeologist would really claim, I think, or would die on the hill that there was nobody in Malta when it was still attached to the mainland. But I think we're sort of confusing two different questions here. Were humans living in Malta when it was attached to the mainland? I think archaeologists would agree with that. They might not be investigating it much, but I think they would definitely agree. Separate question, were humans living on Malta when it became an island, or did they locally die out? But anyway, Dr. Mifsud sort of bring these teeth back into the limelight, paid for his own research into them with experts from Britain's Natural History Museum, confirmed for sure one of these teeth to be a Neanderthal tooth. And I don't have any smart comment to make about it. I think fair play to Dr. Mifsud for being like a citizen scientist and pursuing that and not letting this moment in Maltese prehistory slip by and be ignored, which seemingly it was being ignored. Yeah, I don't have any smart comment to make about it. I really respect him for doing that, putting his own money in to exploring the history of Malta. I presume he's Maltese. So shout out to Dr. Mifsud. But yeah, were people living in Malta when it was an island, once it is separated from mainland Europe? It's an interesting question. The hard thing with a small island like Malta is that the same areas of land are constantly being reused. So any trace of Paleolithic life, sort of hunter-gatherer life before Neolithic farmers got there, would be really small, really subtle, because so much development has happened since then. Archaeologists don't have a problem with even archaic humans like Neanderthals traveling on boats. Many archaeologists believe Neanderthals were on Crete. Crete was an island in the Ice Age, so they had to get there somehow. So archaeologists don't have a problem with archaic humans traveling short distances on water. Obviously, modern Homo sapiens who've lived in Europe for at least 45,000 years can produce boats and sail across that. It's just hard to say for sure because of the intensity of activity on a small island like Malta, the intensity of human activity. But I think archaeologists would be open-minded to that possibility, for sure. Next thing he wanted to talk about on Malta are these mysterious cart ruts. They're called cart ruts. I don't know that we know that that's what they are, but I think cart rut is a good description for them. They're zigzag across Malta, some leading up to the water, which doesn't strike me as odd if they are cart ruts, because it could just be easily explained by people loading and unloading boats at the same dock. Hancock claims that he has found them out to sea as far as 1 kilometer and 25 meters deep, which would for sure mean that they had to be made when Malta was attached to Sicily. I don't know if that's true. It could be true. I wonder if Graham submitted anything to research. Sometimes I wish he would do that. I wish he would try and create a report. I know he doesn't pretend to be an archaeologist, but he doesn't actually have to write the report. He could just do what Dr. Mifsud did and fund like a trip to investigate these things. He's definitely got the money for that, thanks to all his book sales and his Netflix series and his other documentaries and tours and speaking engagements. He's for sure a millionaire. For sure. I don't know. It would be good if he funded something like that. That would be a real legacy for him. We just have to take his word for it that that's what they are, you know. But cart ruts are a bit of a mystery. It's hard to know when a rut was created in the land. Did the people of Malta sort of independently invent the wheel? And that's why these things exist. There's all sorts of possibilities. All sorts. I think archaeologists would definitely admit that we don't really know why these cart ruts were made. I think that's fair to say. Final point on Malta is that we should push back the dating of these temples, back to basically the Younger Dryas, surprise, surprise, based on their alignment to the stars. Even though we know we have radiocarbon dates, there's very good evidence that they are much younger than that. Does their alignment prove that they were built at this earlier time, over the 10,000 years? And here Graham is talking to Lenny Reedike, I think. And her idea is that all these temples in Malta have a slightly different orientation because they all wanted to point to the star Sirius, which has changed its position over the night sky as the Earth wobbles through space. Obviously, we're not just spinning, we're orbiting the sun, and the Earth's also wobbling. So the stars change their position in the night sky very slowly. And she wonders if all these temples have different orientations because they're all pointing to Sirius. And she says that Sirius moves across the sky 1 degree every 72 years. So very, very slowly. And here's what I wonder about this idea. Someone can explain to me in the comments if I'm thinking about this wrong. But if something's moving 1 degree across the sky every 72 years, extremely slowly, moving by 1 degree, isn't everything going to line up at some point? Like if you just accept that they're pointing at Sirius and you're willing to rewind the clock until they all are pointing to Sirius, it seems to me like you're starting with the target and working backwards. I just don't get, like, if you do it that way, if you accept that they're going to point at Sirius and you're willing to just rewind the clock until they all line up, aren't they all going to line up at some point? This is what I don't understand. Let me know in the comments if I'm thinking about that wrong. And anyway, the orientation of these temples is all vaguely south-southeast, all vaguely south-facing. Could we come up with another simpler explanation for their orientation? Maybe they're just wanting a south-facing temple because that's where the sun's going to rise and it's kind of dark inside these buildings. Maybe they're not really fixed to any orientation other than they just want light. Some of these temples, maybe they're responding to features in the landscape. Yeah, I think we could come up with much simpler explanations for the fact that they're vaguely all southeast, southwest facing, other than the fact that they're all pointing to a star. I just don't really get that about that argument. Let me know in the comments if I'm thinking about that wrong. Another idea is that they all sort of face south because what was important to the people in Malta is that the rear wall was facing north, back towards Sicily, where they would have known that they had sailed from, however long ago, and that it is perhaps like an ancestral connection, you know, a connection to their ancestral land in the same way that mosques point to Mecca. These temples are all pointing to Sicily, just their rear wall. I don't know if that's true or not. We can't really prove it either way. We can't prove it either way, really. The point is, I think there are much simpler explanations than they are all aligning with Sirius, especially considering the fact that we do have dates and radiocarbon dates that show these buildings are much younger than that. All right, episode 4, the Bimini Road. What was the name of this episode? Ghosts of a Drowned World. This one, in all honesty, I don't have as much to say about. I'm not a geologist. I found it there are two episodes that I found the least convincing out of all of them. This is definitely one of them. For those that haven't seen it, the Bimini Road is this stretch of really unique rock off the coast of the Bahamas. Hancock says it's a deliberate construction because of the layout of these blocks. They're in a very uniform shape, stretching away from the coastline. Geologists disagree and argue that it's natural beach rock. I'm not a geologist. Nature can make some pretty insane-looking rocks. I don't see any reason to massively doubt that it's natural. You can actually radiocarbon date beach rock because it, when it's forming, like absorbs organic matter from the sea, like mollusks and stuff. And it was radiocarbon dated to 3,500 years old. Other people used uranium thorium dating to date it, and it came to 15,000 years old. There's been some criticism about what's the right dating technique to use for this rock. I don't know. I'm not a geologist. This is why peer review is so important, because I don't know what is the correct methodology for dating beach rock. I did see an article, The Mystique of Beach Rock, and that had some other examples in the Bahamas of these sort of rectangular blocks being formed on different islands. So it doesn't actually seem like it's a unique construction. It's just that this rock is being formed and the sand's eroding away and then the rock's snapping, and the rock tends to snap at 90-degree angles. Like, you've seen people split rock before. It does split very straight. And then it's just sitting in the sea, getting eroded away. The sand underneath it is being washed away. It's slipping down into the water. I don't know. Geologists have lots of explanations for it. I'm not a geologist. I can't really comment. But what I found really weak about this episode was Graham using 16th century maps to try and prove the existence of Atlantis. And one of the maps he pulls out is the Piri Reis map bay made by Ottoman General Piri Reis in 1512, based partly on ancient maps and based partly on the maps that Christopher Columbus created. Very old map. He singles out an island on this map and says it's an image of the Bahamas from 10,000 years ago. This struck me as odd because up until this point in the show, Graham's been very sort of tentative with the evidence of his civilization. You know, he hasn't presented any artifacts, hasn't presented any DNA or bones or anything like that. It's all been about ideas. The idea from agriculture has been passed down. The idea for megalithic construction has been passed down. But in this one, for this theory of his to be correct, a map, a physical map, would have had to have been passed down from the Younger Dryas all the way to the 16th century, surviving 12,000 years, roughly. I just don't think that's possible. It's a really odd claim because we have ancient maps from Roman times and earlier in the medieval period that don't show America at all because they didn't know it was there. Don't show Antarctica at all because they didn't know it was there. For this claim to be correct, we'd have had to have these ancient maps that were passed down until the 16th century. And yet, at no point in between the 16th century and the Younger Dryas did anyone make a copy of them, a surviving copy of them. But they survived until the 16th century, just as Europeans are starting to explore the world. You know, the parts of the world they're choosing to illustrate, like the Caribbean and Antarctica and stuff, are the parts of the world that we're just starting to tentatively explore. I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. What really, I feel like, is a huge piece of information that Graham left out of it is that next to the island that Graham thinks is the Bahamas, because of their orientation and all of this, that, you know, it's this grand Bahama island that's 10,000 years old. Piri Reis wrote on the map Hispaniola, the island that today contains the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And Graham's right that there is some debate amongst scholars as to whether Piri Reis really was trying to talk about Cuba, but he wrote Hispaniola. I don't know. But next to Hispaniola, that he literally wrote as Hispaniola, Piri Reis wrote, there have been several discussions about the place and location of these islands. So right next to this island that Graham Hancock is claiming to be the Bahamas from 10,000 years ago, the literal creator of the map wrote, it's Hispaniola, And, there's some debate about the location and place of this island. So we're not sure about it. So, yeah, I mean, Graham didn't mention this in the show, but you're basically left with the choice. Do I trust Graham's interpretation that is so convoluted, or do I trust the literal creator of the map? I'm going to trust Piri Reis and his annotations. There is another possible explanation for why he got the orientation of Hispaniola or Cuba wrong. And as we all know, Christopher Columbus was trying to get to Asia. And when he got to the Americas, he thought he had done it, basically. He was like, boom, Asia, let's go. And Europeans already kind of knew from like the travels of Marco Polo and all of this stuff and the intermittent contact they'd had with Far Asia that Japan was an island orientated, north to south. And Christopher Columbus apparently thought he had reached Japan, or Chipango, as he might have called it. And we can see still this labeling of Hispaniola as Japan, even in later maps. Like, here's a map, the Caspar Vopal world map. Underneath Hispaniola, he wrote Zipango. And this is a map from 1548. After there'd been a lot more explanation, people were still like, oh, is this Japan? Is Hispaniola Japan? And obviously they knew Japan was orientated north-south, so they're sort of thinking like, oh, how should we portray this on the map? And then, also he says that the Piri Reis map illustrates the coast of Antarctica when there was no ice there or something like that, rather than just Piri Reis, running out of room, and so he's just moving the coastline of South America down across the paper. You could believe Graham Hancock that this is evidence of a lost map, but what Piri Reis wrote next to this thing that he's calling Antarctica is like, this is where all the snakes live, and it's known to be very hot. That's why the Portuguese haven't explored there. So that would be a really odd thing to write if you knew that the region was Antarctica. I feel like the fact that Graham Hancock has left out the annotations on the map is kind of misleading. I could be wrong because I can't read Turkish in the modern alphabet. I certainly can't read it using the Arabic alphabet. I'm relying on other people's translations, so I could be wrong. But if this is what Piri Reis wrote on the map, it's kind of annoying to not have that context included. That's so crucial to this whole thing. But Graham Hancock says this, designation of Antarctica is supported because in other maps, Antarctica appears, and he pulls out the Orontius Phineas map. Once again, first thing to note about this map, we have a rectangular Hispaniola, again, suggesting that interpretation of Piri Reis map is correct. As for Antarctica, as for why Antarctica appears on the Orontius Phineas map, my understanding, could be wrong, my understanding, though, is that people had long worked out the circumference of the Earth, and they knew there was all this land in the northern hemisphere, and so they had assumed there would be all this land in the southern hemisphere. They thought that Earth had to be sort of balanced out like that, and they called this region like Terra Australis, or Terra Australis Incognito. And you can see on even later maps, even as they know way more about the world, they're still putting Terra Australis Incognita on the map. Graham shows you on the Orontius Phineas map that they had called this landmass Antarctica, but he doesn't translate any of the other words, which is Terra Australis Recenta Inventa Sed Nondum Plene Cognita, which according to Google Translate means southern land found recently but not fully known. Again, I feel like that's just a crucial piece of context that Graham deliberately misses out. I can't help but feel like he's so determined to prove the existence of his civilization that he's even clutching at very weak evidence. This is clearly a guy who's creating a map from bits and pieces that he's getting from other incomplete world maps. He's trying to assemble a whole thing. Milo of Mini Minuteman fame did a good video on this. Go check it out. Shout out to him. I hope I've beaten him into making this Graham Hancock video. Competition in the archaeology YouTube world. Yeah, I just feel like Graham's really misleading us here. He's really not providing any context to help us understand these maps. And as well, if these maps were from the Ice Age, Why is Europe shown with a modern coastline? Where's Atlantis? Clearly these maps are created by people that had a good understanding of Europe and the Mediterranean, and as it gets further and further away, the map gets less and less accurate. That's exactly what we would expect from these early days of exploration. All right, episode 5, Gobekli Tepe, Legacy of the Sages. Well, I've probably got a lot to say about this because I know more about this time period than most others. Could be wrong, though. I'm not an expert. Could be wrong. Let's start on a positive. I do 100% agree with Graham where at the start of the episode he's talking about how light pollution has really cut us off from understanding and observing the night sky. That's really something that we lack in our modern world compared to our ancestors, and it's a big tragedy. I 100% agree with Graham there at the start of the episode. As Graham says, people in ancient times would have had an unfiltered view of the night sky every day of their lives, unless it was cloudy, obviously, and they'd have been extremely familiar with the positions of all the stars and everything and their movements. This is why I find the fact that he uses astronomy as evidence for this lost civilization so uncompelling, because, as he says right there at the beginning, people would be so familiar with the night sky. So it's really odd. He almost lays the case for why we don't need Atlantis straight at the start of this episode. But then again, he's back to what if it's more than that? What if it's more than that? What if it's a connection to an ancient society? I don't know. If your auntie had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. I know I said that already. If your auntie had balls, she'd be your uncle. The first thing he wonders is that why would people go to all these lengths to build these monuments? Is it to warn us of something? This idea I really have to push back on. They made these monuments because they're important to them. And they sincerely believed in their worldview as strongly as we now believe in our worldview, and we would create big monuments and big buildings and things like that. So the idea that we have to question their motives, why would they do this in prehistory, is really odd. They would do it for the same reasons we do it, would do these kinds of things, because it's cool and we believe in it. I absolutely guarantee, though, that they weren't thinking of us when they did it. This whole idea that it's a warning for us, that, to me, I strongly disagree with. We're not that important, man. They built it for their own reasons. They did not build it for us. I'm reminded that at the very start of this season, Graham Hancock said that viewing our time period now as the most advanced point in human development can make us be arrogant and dismissive of the past. And that's 100% true. But I also feel like it's very arrogant to assume that people 10,000 years ago cared about us in any way. To imagine that we're involved in their story seems to me kind of arrogant and self-centered as well. Like we're putting our time into their story. And I just really strongly disagree with that. They built it for their reasons. It has nothing to do with us, not to warn us. Then he says that the Sumerians were the first civilization is crying out to be rewritten. I would say in the same way that Graham is really dismissive of hunter-gatherer societies, and that's sort of an old way of speaking. Constantly talking about civilization is not really the language that archaeologists would use anymore. As civilization is such a vague term, it's hard to define, tends to promote a Eurocentric view of human development. The example I like to think about is like Anglo-Saxon England is roughly contemporary with Teotihuacan. And at Teotihuacan, they were building these enormous monuments, huge cities, incredible stuff. But as far as I'm aware, they didn't have writing. Meanwhile, in Anglo-Saxon England, we are abandoning our cities, at least in the early period. And we're really going back to a much simpler form of life. The population of Roman Britain has crashed. We're really taking a step back in many, many ways. But we do have writing. So it's, in the traditional view of civilization, England would be more civilized maybe because we have writing, even though at that period of time we're just doing way less. It's just so hard to define and vague, this civilization. What is a civilization? It's just not how archaeologists speak about the past anymore. Definitely used to, but that's the kind of language that they would avoid now, I would say. Even though we know a lot about prehistory now and we know so much more about what our ancestors were up to and it's amazing stuff, I would say let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sumerian civilization, if that's what we're going to call it, society, was incredible. They really are the first literate society, and they really achieved a lot. So, even though we know about sites like Gobekli Tepe and all of that stuff, let's not get dismissive about how awesome the Sumerians were. They really were, a key moment in the development of humanity. Anyway, Gobekli Tepe. For those that don't know, it's one of the oldest megalithic sites in the entire world. When it was discovered, I believe it was the oldest megalithic site in the world. Really stunning place. Graham describes it as recently excavated. I don't know. Was 1995 recently? I kind of feel like agreeing with him just so I sound young and relevant. But even when I was at university 12 years ago studying the Neolithic, we're talking about Gobekli Tepe. I don't know. Graham always goes on about how it's, defies everything we've been taught about prehistory. We're just not being taught about prehistory. I think that's a shame. I think we should be taught more about prehistory. I wrote a children's book about prehistory, available from all good retailers. Excellent Christmas present for any children 8 to 11 years old in your life that love prehistory. We cover the whole world. We talk about Gobekli Tepe. But yeah, we're not really taught about prehistory. And when Graham went to school in the 60s, so definitely our view of prehistory has changed a lot since he was taught about it in school. I don't know. I just don't know what he means by that, but certainly in the education I've received 12 years ago, we're talking about Gobekli Tepe. But yeah, actually thinking about it, even in Graham Hancock's day, we knew that the Neolithic people were constructing megalithic monuments. Obviously, we knew about Stonehenge. But even in that region, there was the Tower of Jericho, which even in like the 1950s, they were aware dated to like the early Neolithic period. Again, I don't know why Graham Hancock always brings up this phrase. We've known that Neolithic people have built megalithic constructions for a long time. I think how Gobekli Tepe did change our understanding is that we probably would have thought that there was some more urban development before they built these huge monuments. Klaus Schmidt, the main person behind its initial excavation, sadly passed away, R.I.P. But he had this famous phrase, "Zuerst kam der Tempel, dann die Stadt." Like, first came the temple, then the town. And probably before Gobekli Tepe, maybe we'd have thought about that differently. So it did change our understanding of prehistory. I don't want to diminish its impact. One thing that did annoy me is Graham said archaeologists accept that it dates to 11,600 years old. Makes it sound like archaeologists are dragging their feet in talking about it like that. Archaeologists are literally the people who discovered it dated to back then. So I just dislike that turn of phrase. Putting archaeologists down, man, who are making discoveries that are so central to his ideas. He's just putting them down. Seems like it to me. Another really misleading phrase is when he describes Gobekli Tepe as older than the domestication of the horse. That's so misleading because the horse is like the last animal we domesticated. It's older than the domestication of pig, cow, chicken, sheep, goats, wheat, rice, barley, corn, potatoes. It's older than the domestication of all of those. But again, Graham Hancock can't really talk about food, because then the next question is, well, what did people eat on Atlantis? So again, that's just a really misleading turn of phrase. He definitely deliberately picked horse because he doesn't want to raise those questions. That's definitely deliberate, I would say. There is an interesting debate as to whether Gobekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, though, because it is described as that a lot, and that's because all the grains that have been found there are wild grains, not domesticated, because before the domestication of wheat. The animals that were found there are gazelles, I believe, mainly. No domesticated animals. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that domestication was a really long process, took thousands of years. The people that built Gobekli Tepe, just because they're consuming wild grains, doesn't mean they're not participating in the cultivation of them or managing the landscape. So the people that built Gobekli Tepe, I still imagine their lifestyle having a lot more in common with a Neolithic farmer than a fully nomadic hunter-gatherer. They're definitely I'm sure leading more sedentary lives, helping participate in the cultivation of these wild grains, I would have thought. This is the early days of plant domestication. You wouldn't expect domesticated grains to appear in the record as soon as people started living a lifestyle like that, because it's going to take a while for the selection of grains to leave like a genetic trace. You see what I mean? Graham can't really concede all of this nuance because he needs people to have been taught agriculture. Inside are these enormous pillars. Hancock describes it as Noah's Ark in stone. I mean, he's trying deliberately to link it to those myths. One thing he really zeroes in on is that enclosure D is the biggest enclosure. It's probably the oldest enclosure, and it's the most elaborate enclosure. He has all these phrases that, you can't just wake up and build the largest enclosure that anyone's ever built. And, the fact that the oldest enclosure is the biggest means that someone else has taught them how to do this. I really disagree with this idea. Like, if you look in your town, like in my hometown of Worcester, the biggest and most elaborate building is a cathedral that was built 800 years ago. In the whole history of our town since then, we haven't built a more elaborate building. And yet society still goes on. And that's because people have different motivations at different times to build different things, and society changes, and the cost of things changes, and the cost of labor changes. And there are all these factors that can affect why you make a bigger building and a smaller building, and all of this doesn't mean that you were taught how to do it by someone else. A simple explanation for why they never made an enclosure like enclosure D again is because they still had enclosure D. And these rooms are being renovated and reused throughout the life of Gobekli Tepe. It's a very complicated site. Just because enclosure D is oldest doesn't mean they learned these things from someone else. There's no reason to think that, really. As for just waking up and deciding to do that's obviously a ridiculous phrase on Graham's part, or how did he put it? Succeeding brilliantly at their very first attempt at making a megalithic structure. Come on, that's such a lack of nuance there. Who's Graham to say that this is their very first attempt at a megalithic construction? He can't go back in time and ask them. It ignores the fact that people have been building with stone for thousands of years before this, as I've already explained. It ignores the possibility that they were creating monuments out of wood before this time. And most importantly of all, it ignores the really obvious point that the archaeological record is incomplete. We could discover a smaller Gobekli Tepe tomorrow, a smaller and older one. Who's Graham to say that this is their very first attempt at building a megalithic structure? That's ridiculous. And then he literally, just 1 minute later in the show, mentions a possibly earlier site, Karahan Tepe. I don't know how he can have these two ideas in his head or talk about them side by side in the show like that. You can't wake up one day and make Gobekli Tepe with no prior skills. You need to work on things and get better and better. Oh, by the way, here's a possibly even older site. How can those two scenes in the show sit side by side next to each other? I don't know. Karahan Tepe is a crazy site, though, another megalithic site. I do definitely agree with Graham. That head poking out of the rock really has a sinister feel to it. But it's not even the only earlier site that archaeologists have found. I've been following a lot of archaeologists. Shout out to all of them on Twitter who've been talking about this idea. Orhan Ayaz of Haran University. Shout out to him for sharing this information. Here we have sites 300 years older than Gobekli Tepe, using wooden poles, stones that are not T-shaped, just flatter, simpler. Is this not evidence of the development that Graham is looking for? Anyway, we go back to Gobekli Tepe. This time Graham's joined by Dr. Sweatman, who believes that the symbols on Pillar 43 are depictions of star signs. And he creates this really elaborate idea that if you say these are star signs, then you look at their position, and then you look in the sky to when the stars were last in these positions, and it's going to point to 10,900 BC, the start of the Younger Dryas. This is just pure gibberish. In a show where I disagree with most stuff, this is really gibberish. Talk about starting with a target and working your way backwards. I love prehistory. I really love prehistory as much as the next guy. But let's be realistic. what the symbols meant to the people that built Gobekli Tepe, we will never, ever, 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 ever know. We can never ask them. They're long dead. They didn't write anything down. We can only come to very simple conclusions. Is this vulture and scorpion a star sign and it's pointing to the sky at this particular time and blah, 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 and it's holding a comet or something, or the sun? We'll never know. We'll never know. It doesn't mean that, or did they just live in an environment with vultures and scorpions and they're, representing their life and their environment in their art? That's obviously, Occam's razor would suggest that that's what they're doing. Forgot to say, archaeologists no longer believe that it was deliberately backfilled either. There's just a much more likely explanation of it being filled in slowly, considering the fact that it's in an earthquake zone, considering the fact that Gobekli Tepe is on a sort of hollow, not at the very top of the hill. It's just much more likely that it was just gradually filled in over time than deliberately buried. That was one of the hypotheses when the site was first being excavated, but that's not really what archaeologists think anymore. To conclude episode 5, the Neolithic didn't happen overnight. It really took thousands of years. Building these monuments didn't happen overnight. The idea that Graham said they just woke up and decided to do it, it's not supported by the archaeological record. We now have simpler sites that are hundreds of years older than Gobekli Tepe, and it just ignores the fact that we could discover more, and that they were building with stone, and that they were building with wood, and blah, blah, blah. All these nuance and caveats that Graham ignores. The idea that it's some sort of time capsule trying to tell us about a comet impact at the start of the younger Dryas, we just can't ever know that. That's really way beyond the scope of archaeology, way beyond what we can ever hope to understand about them. And again, it's sort of putting us in their story. It's kind of a very arrogant, self-centered view, I would say. My camera died. I'm going to do 2 episodes on my phone whilst I let it charge. Episode 6, over in America now. I'll start by agreeing with Graham Hancock. Obviously, it's a tragedy how many native sites have been destroyed across America. People too, obviously. But, thinking of archaeology and the history that was lost, it's terrible, really terrible. So I agree with Graham there to start the video. First site we visit is Poverty Point. Huge, massive site down in Louisiana. It's a series of mounds connected by concentric rings, covers absolutely acres. It's massive, massive place. There's definitely some parties going on in the middle of that circle, I'm sure. Some feasting going down, I would bet. And, it's the same argument that we've heard in all the other episodes. The alignment of Poverty Point matches various alignments in the sky. Graham thinks these are, seeds and knowledge from Atlantis. I don't. It's the same argument as all the other episodes. He does get into a funny moment with the manager of the site, Mark Brink Jr., about the purpose of these circles, these sort of circles of post holes that they find across Poverty Point, and about whether these had any astronomical significance if they're aligned to any points. Mark Brink does not think so. We don't know why, because they cut it out annoyingly. I would love to know why he didn't think that, but we won't know. And then Graham tries this funny gotcha moment where he's like, why do you think the people of this Poverty Point weren't interested in the sky? And Mark's like, what? I never said that. I bet they were. And, but we don't know what the circles are for. We just don't know. Again, there's such a contrast between how Graham says archaeologists and historians are and how they actually act. He just freely admits we don't know, which is true. In defense of Mark Brinks here, I will say that with a circle, when we can't see the monument, we're just left with the silhouette of a circle, post holes of a circle. We could probably make it align to anything, couldn't we? We could probably make it align to anything we wanted to. It is hard when the monument is gone, when we can't ask anyone what they were doing, how to align a circle up to points, a circle of just post holes. So Graham thinks there's some sort of calendar. Could be absolutely correct. We'll never know. Then we move on to Serpent Mound, out of Louisiana up to Ohio, home of the Logan and Jake Paul, the great state of Ohio. Graham starts off by being annoyed that the sign outside says Serpent Mound dates to 1000 AD, whereas some radiocarbon dates say it might date to 300 BC. This is true. The dating of the site is currently debated. The updating of the sign, I don't really think archaeologists are to blame for that. There's lots of signs all around the world that could probably do with being updated. But Graham wants to push this site back 10,000 years because he believes Serpent Mound is illustrating a comet flying across the sky, and he believes a comet impact caused the Younger Dryas. So he wants to project it back 10,000 years in time. He also believes the alignment of the mound would be better 10,000 years in the past. Here's where it gets kind of interesting. Let's take the date of 1000 AD, when people are for sure still renovating Serpent Mound and using it as a ritual center. That is about the time that Halley's Comet flew through the sky. Famously, it flew through the sky in 1066, just before the Norman invasion of England. Is considered a big omen. And so the date, if Serpent Mound is intended to illustrate a comet, and we don't know that, but if it is, 1000 AD approximately is a good date for it to have been made. As for those earlier radiocarbon dates, 300 AD, we don't know what, if it was renovated later on at 1000 AD, we don't know what they changed. Maybe they added that sort of egg-shaped comet at the front of the serpent. We don't know. That's kind of stuff is really hard to say. But it is funny that 1000 AD does line up with a known comet that regularly flies across the sky. As for the alignments of the other bends in the serpent, corresponding to different moments in the year, I don't think archaeologists have a massive problem with that. As Graham portrays. Just again, how do we know? How do we know? It definitely could be that. And I think that's a pretty good hypothesis, honestly, because people do like to track the passage of time. It's important for all sorts of reasons. As for the alignment, it's 2 degrees off, pointing towards this valley, is where, the solstice is either the solstice or the equinox. The hard thing with an earth mound, like Serpent Mound, is earth can slip and slide and do all sorts of things. It's hard to arrange earth precisely rather than a stone. I think a stone is easier to place precisely than an earth mound. I think that's my own bias there. So for earth mound, I would honestly forgive it being 2 degrees off, especially when you consider the fact that it's been renovated many times, probably. It's certainly been renovated back at the end of the 19th century, when people finally started to care a little bit about preserving native sites. So I would forgive an earthen mound being 2 degrees off. I certainly wouldn't feel the need to project it back in time 10,000 years to account for 2 degrees of angle. Now, Graham is not happy with the current custodians of Serpent Mound, though, because they refused his access to film, and which he describes as censorship. Is it censorship? Do archaeologists practice censorship? Is Graham Hancock being censored here? Best take on this I heard was from Miles Greb from the Plastic Plesiosaur podcast, which he does with Trey the Explainer. They had me on as a guest. We've been talking about Graham Hancock's show. He put it like this: it's not really academic censorship because Graham isn't proposing a study to be done. He's not submitting a plan for research or anything like that. He just wants to film a documentary. So it's not really academic censorship in that sense. I think the key piece of context here that Graham misses out is that Serpent Mound is a religious site, still very important to modern native people, modern Indians in the area. And for some reason, there are some like extremist Christian groups who believe it's like a portal to hell. They turn up and they pray and they claim it in the name of Jesus, and the native groups really dislike that. They really, really dislike that. And rightly so, because then it wouldn't be allowed to go into a church and perform their traditional rituals. And Serpent Mound is a religious site to them. You know, when we view it in that context, we can be empathetic to the idea that they don't like someone coming along and saying that the idea behind this mound was, you know, the product of another civilization. Empathetic and understand why that would annoy them. Graham calls it an archaeological site, which is true, obviously, in one sense, but, you know, to them it's not just an archaeological site, it's a religious site. And considering the big spiel Graham gave at the start of the episode about how many native sites have been destroyed, how much information has been lost, blah, 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 you would think he would be a bit more sensitive to that. You would think he could understand that position better. I don't know. I think it was a bad look to be hating on the fact that he wasn't allowed to film at Serpent Mound. If he really wanted to get to the bottom of the mystery there, I think he would have to work with native people in building like some trust and in building a plan to do some proper research, not just film a big budget documentary. Funny, that one. Didn't like that one, honestly. Didn't like how he phrased that. I don't like how all the context is removed from Graham's discussions. Final part of this episode, though, he's setting up to discuss the Younger Dryas, which he describes as an apocalyptic event that humanity barely survived. He absolutely has to portray the Younger Dryas this way. For Hancock, the Younger Dryas is the reason why every trace of his civilization is gone. Every single trace. And so for him, it has to be the most apocalyptic event that humans have lived through. For archaeologists, don't share that opinion that this civilization was wiped out. So we can take a lot more nuanced look at the Younger Dryas and its effect on people. But for Graham and people that believe in Atlantis, it has to be the biggest cataclysm to end all cataclysms, because otherwise, how can we explain the lack of evidence for this civilization? Think about it now. This is an 8-part series. We're at the end of episode 6. Still not a single artifact from this civilization. That's hard to explain. Younger Dryas has to be terrible. Episode 7, to me, it's like the Bimini Road. This one I just found so unconvincing, unrelated really to Graham's arguments. I don't know. We're back in Turkey, Cappadocia region, a site called Derinkuyu. Incredible underground complex that people have chiseled out of the soft rock. You know, dating a site like that is really tricky, obviously. He said in the show that parts of it seem to date to the 8th century because of artifacts found in there. But, you know, just because part of it dates to that time period doesn't mean all of it does, like we saw with Mexico and places like that, Mesoamerica, Gobekli Tepe, Malta. Sites are expanded on for long periods of time. Who knows what was built in the 8th century? It's probably been added on for literally centuries. There's an interesting exchange between Hancock and the historian, where Hancock is saying, like, academia's gone too far, saying it's dates from the 8th century. And the historian just goes, yeah, it could be. That's just the most plausible theory, not the only theory. Once again, it's just such a contrast between how Hancock talks about people in academia and how the people in academia behave on the show. It's just always so funny. And what I really found funny about this particular one is that about 21 minutes in, he says only a highly motivated culture would build something like this, and to him that motivation is a comet impact. I don't know if Graham thinks that this is the survivors of the comet impact that built there in Kuyu, or if it is people that lived before that time who could predict that the comet impact is coming, and so they're going to build a bomb shelter. Maybe I missed that in the show. I don't know which way round he thinks that is. But why that's so funny is because earlier on, he had said how bad the Assyrians were. Like, that, part of the rationale of building it in the 8th century BC was that was the time when the Assyrian army was rampaging around the region. And they would impale you, flail your skin, burn your children alive. Is that not motivating? If all of that's going to happen to you if you don't avoid this army, that seems extremely motivating. Do we have a single artifact to suggest that it dates from an earlier time? No. Any reason to push it back in time 10,000 years? No. It's just, we just have to accept Graham's word for these things. I don't know. This and the Bimini Road, I feel like could have been cut from the whole show. Didn't need to be in there. All right, here we go. Episode 8, the last episode for Graham Hancock to prove the existence of his civilization. Cataclysm and rebirth. Bum, 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 bum. As I said before, Graham Hancock needs this younger Dryas to be as big an apocalyptic event as possible, because he has to explain the disappearance of Atlantis, of this civilization. Yeah, we start with the line that our ancestors suddenly started farming after the younger Dryas. That's not true. It took thousands of years. It really took thousands of years for a true farming lifestyle to develop. Let me give you a specific example. This is The First Farmers of Europe by Stephen Shannon, an evolutionary perspective. Pretty much summarizing the latest research on the development of farming in the Neolithic. Yeah, so here we're talking about a couple of sites. We've got 11,700 years ago, a site called Tel Caramel in northern Syria. 22% of the wheat chaff seems to have come from a domesticated species, so 78% is still wild. At Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, by 8,700 years ago, 95% of the chaff seems to come from domesticated species and only 5% from wild species. So that's 3,000 years it took for domesticated grains to be like the vast majority of the grains in an archaeological assemblage. That's what I mean when I say it took thousands of years. People were intensively using wild grains for a long time before that. But for true farming to develop and domestication traits to appear, it really took thousands of years. All right. Last episode, Cataclysm and Rebirth. Graham Hancock's last chance to really wow us with the evidence for this lost civilization. I'd like to point out that so far, 7 episodes in, we have not seen a single artifact, monument, bone, DNA result, radiocarbon date, anything that proves the existence of this civilization. Just the idea that the ideas behind civilization came from them. And, myths, various myths, which again, we can't take uncritically. What about all the myths that don't talk about a cataclysm, all of this stuff, so many things to consider. But this is it. Last episode, we're talking about the younger Dryas, and, We're talking about the catastrophic flooding and possible comet impact. I don't really have much to say about the causes of the Younger Dryas. As far as I'm concerned, if it was caused by a comet, that's fine. If it was exacerbated by a comet, that's fine too. It was an absolutely terrible climatic event. That's all fine. Point is, from an archaeological perspective, how did humans react to this? So it starts off with his friend Randall Carlson. Yeah, so we're over in the Scablands, over in Washington State, with Randall Carlson. He is another very famous figure, kind of like Graham Hancock in these circles. He's big into the geology, though. The Scablands are this enormous valley, I suppose you could call it, in Washington, that seemingly was caused by a catastrophic flood, a series of catastrophic floods. No one really doubts that. Randall Carlson thinks that happens in one flood. It seems that other geologists think it might have been a couple of floods. I don't know, 3, 4, maybe 1. I don't know. I think the debate is still out on that point. One interesting thing, though, is that Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson don't like the dating behind these events. It seems that the first flood was maybe around 18,000 years ago. The last flood was maybe around 14,000 years ago, at least according to this paper I read. But Randall Carlson and Graham don't really love that, because that doesn't really line up with their ideas that the Younger Dryas was the cause of all these bad things. And if the dates change, the dates change. It doesn't bother me. Point is, how do humans react? But for the sake of argument, let's say everything they say is true, that this event was during the Younger Dryas, that it was the biggest flood in human history, that the second scientist that Graham meets with, Alan West, is right, that a comet caused the Younger Dryas, big fires across America. Let's, for the sake of argument, concede all of those are true, even though they are very heavily debated, and the dates for these events don't line up. Let's say that they're all 100% true. Was that enough to wipe every trace of this civilization off the planet? Let's start with flooding and sea level rises, because the civilization has to be under the water. If they were building cities and farming inland, we'd have found them. So they have to be like an exclusively maritime civilization. There is a debate amongst geologists how much sea level rose around the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was preceded by a period of sharp warming, and then something caused the Younger Dryas. How did this affect sea levels? And there was seemingly a faster than average rise in sea level at that time. It's called Meltwater Pulse 1b. If you're imagining a giant tidal wave sweeping across the Earth, though, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Most of the estimates I've read, they're talking about millimeters of sea rise a year. In this one study from 2016, they're estimating a sea level rise of 40 millimeters a year, 4 centimeters, which, let's call a spade. If they're right, that wouldn't be enough to scrub every trace of this civilization off the planet, would it? That's still a lot, though. Imagine how much water is in the ocean. Raising that by 4 centimeters. That's a huge amount of water. So it's not to be underestimated as such, but that's plainly not enough to scrub every trace of this civilization off the planet. Could they be wrong? Sure, they could be wrong. But multiple studies seem to be suggesting that it's millimeters a year. Let's say the Scablands was a major source of all of this water. Anyone living in that region is for sure going to be having a terrible time of it. I have no doubt that people that lived around there certainly felt the impact of those floods. That would be crazy to argue. What if this civilization was in Sunderland in Indonesia? Are they going to feel the impacts of all that water rushing into the ocean? I don't think so. I don't think they would. I don't think they would notice. The Younger Dryas, it seems, only really drastically affected the northern hemisphere. There's actually a debate as to whether it was noticeable in the southern hemisphere at all. The final extinction of a lot of megafauna in the Americas with the Younger Dryas suggests that something was going on, but Many of these animals are in a long-term decline, it seems, before the Younger Dryas. Maybe they survived after it in isolated refugia. Certainly in some islands around the world, mammoths did survive after the Younger Dryas. But it does seem that a lot of species of megafauna became extinct at that time. And if you're a human, I'm sure you're going to notice that. Worst case scenario, it does seem that some regions of the world were depopulated. Around the Great Lakes, probably because of all this flooding, it seems like nobody's living there anymore. Northernmost island of Japan, Hokkaido, seemingly abandoned. Burials in Britain, human burials in Britain, stop. So if there are people living in Britain, certainly something has really affected their lifestyle to the point where they've stopped burying people. They're disposing of them in a different way, or maybe the population of Britain has declined a lot in that time. So I think for people that lived in areas where there was maybe some flooding, in very northern regions, they would have noticed a return to the conditions of the Ice Age. That seems to be true. But in other regions, it's more complicated, As archaeologist Matthew Boulanger points out, in the northeast of the USA, we don't seem to have people living there until the Younger Dryas. It can't have been that bad for them in that region if they're moving there. If that's the first appearance of people, it seems like can't have been affected that badly. Across the USA at this time, there was this Clovis culture. It doesn't really persist after the Younger Dryas. But if we take a look at, say, the Western USA, the successor culture to Clovis was called the Folsom culture by archaeologists. By the way, these are just archaeological terms for material culture. We don't have any idea how these people envisage their ethnicity or anything like that. These are just names for groups of tools, basically. But you can see Clovis tool, Folsom tool, there's a lot of similarities. I think it's extremely reasonable to believe that whoever created Folsom tools were the descendants of people who made Clovis tools, and the fact that they're switching it up a bit maybe is down to the fact that they're hunting different game. The megafauna are now gone. Folsom hunters seem to have been really into hunting bison, who obviously survived that time period because bison, very famously lived across the prairies in America. And yeah, Folsom people don't seem to be struggling that much, maybe. There are sites, like the original Folsom site, it's like a mass killing of 32 bison. That's not going to be easy. They seem to be focusing their hunting strategy on areas of America where they can trap bison or send bison over bison jumps, maybe. So they're doing okay, I think. They're capable of hunting on quite a large scale, very mobile, adaptable groups of hunters. Doesn't seem to me like they're in the midst of an apocalypse, clinging to life. The only person actually found in association with Clovis tools was a child called the Anzac child, and they're an ancestor or a relative of modern Native Americans, for sure. So there's clearly some genetic continuity between that time and the modern times. Over in Japan, I mentioned the northern island was depopulated, but in other areas of Japan, life seems to be going on pretty much as normal. They're still hunting sika deer. They're still making pottery. Maybe there is a decline in population. That's probably expected with a sudden 1,000-year return to the Ice Age conditions. The population might decline, but it doesn't seem like people's lives are that affected. I think it would be fair to say that the response to the Younger Dryas varied a lot around the world. That's probably the fairest summary. And because of that, when archaeologists are excavating a site in that time period, I don't think they can take anything for granted. If, we have to prove everything, basically. We have to look at this site in this specific location and try and work out how people were adapting to this climate change. The idea that it was so devastating to human life that we're clinging on and that everything is scrubbed from the planet just isn't there. It just is not there. And that's a huge problem for this theory, because this is it. This is the last episode, 8 episodes in. Let's think about what evidence Graham Hancock has provided. any material remains whatsoever from this civilization? No. Any human remains? No. Any genetic evidence of this civilization, either in humans or animals or plants? Any idea what they were eating at all? No. No evidence of this. Just the notion that the ideas underpinning the Neolithic, like monumental architecture, farming, agriculture, just that these ideas came from this earlier civilization. Just the vague notion of that. But do we even have a good explanation for why it was scrubbed entirely off the earth? No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so. The younger Dryas just wasn't that bad. For some people it probably was, but not on a global scale. There's just no evidence for that level of devastation. It all really comes down to myth. You just have to believe sort of unquestionably that flood myths around the world are referring to the same flood. Not that it can't just be lots of different floods. You have to believe that any sort of mythical founder of any civilization or kingdom or religion or anything like that, not myths, not people trying to explain their history or to, give importance to their history by aligning it with gods and things like that. You have to believe that these were real Atlanteans. That's the only thing really going for this argument, and I don't feel like you can accept that uncritically, honestly. This video was brought to you by Morning Brew, a free daily newsletter that in 5 minutes is going to tell you everything you need to know about tech, finance, business, the industries that dominate our world, that drive our modern society. It's a great way to start your day. Don't wake up and doom scroll on social media. That's an absolutely terrible way to start your day. Morning Brew is going to keep you informed, keep you entertained with witty, relevant articles. I don't know if you can read that. I learned today that the first cannabis dispensaries are opening up in New York City, which has been delayed by over a year, partly because of lawsuits, but also partly because the first 150 licenses have been set aside for people who had cannabis convictions or their families to start businesses, and also for non-profits. And they were trying to make sure those licenses went to the right people. I'd have never learned that if I'd have turned on the news or scrolled through social media. And that's a feel-good story to start my day. That's societal progress as far as I'm concerned. There's no reason not to subscribe. If you're interested in tech, finance, business, all these things, it's going to give you the gossip. It's going to keep you informed. It's entirely free, totally free. Just takes a few seconds to sign up. Link is in the description. Link is in the pinned comment. Thank you so much to Morning Brew for making this possible. Atlantis was not real, guys. It just was not real. I'm sorry. Maybe Morning Brew will do an article about it. They should do.